AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former intelligence officers and those who write about them. And today I have a fascinating guest. Leon Carroll is a former Marine Corps officer. And after the Marine Corps, he joined the Naval Criminal Investigative Service as a special agent, serving in 7 different locations, including afloat. Toward the end of his career, he was the special agent in charge of the NCIS office in Panama City and the Pacific Northwest. After leaving NCIS, Leon was hired as the technical advisor to the famous TV series with Mark Harmon of the same name. Leon, welcome to AFIO Now.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for having me on.
Leon, you've got a fascinating book out that I just finished reading and thoroughly enjoyed. It's called Ghosts of Honolulu, and I thought it was a terrific story, very well researched and very well written. Could you tell us a little bit about the early life of the key person in the book, Douglas Wada?
Sure. Jim, thanks again for that great intro. It's my pleasure to be here for AFIO. Doug Wada, he is now a legend within the organization. Not so probably before our book was released. In fact, I personally didn't know anything about Doug Wada. And thanks to 2 individuals who retired, Vic McPherson and Matt Parsons, who are retired NCIS agents, and the research that they did that ended up on the NCIS Association's website, the history site, that we were able to be introduced to Doug Wada. So Doug Wada was born in 1910, actually, and grew up in Hawaii. He was a Nisei generation Japanese American. His father was a Japanese carpenter, Shinto carpenter, who immigrated to Hawaii. And he then built Shinto shrines in Hawaii. And Doug Wada himself grew up as basically what we would consider a working class American. He was active in Boy Scouts, all types of things that you would see from pretty much any American at that particular time, and still maintained his cultural background. His family, mom and dad, really wanted to make sure that was in touch. And actually, when he graduated from high school, they sent him back to Japan. He was there for 4 years to learn culture and perfect the Japanese language, which he spoke. But it's always good to be able to speak and be able to speak with people in that particular culture. He loved being a bicyclist as a kid. In fact, one of the big traumatic things that happened to him was seeing his older brother, being killed by a truck when they were both riding. And that particular incident really affected his life. He definitely was the kind of guy who was low key. He was a small guy, very athletic in all sports. He was about 5'4", 5'2" maybe. But baseball was his thing. And he was on the baseball teams in Hawaii. And actually this whole baseball thing hit me close because we were writing about this, and I found out about the Japanese American League that exists to this day here in Southern California. And we have a team in the South Bay here called the Gardena Rebels. And I was introduced to them and provided a book, and they read it, and they learned a lot about the history of what the Japanese Americans had done. And I was really surprised that had happened, but I was also surprised that this league is actually a minor league team for professional ball players, AA, and they're really good. And that really allowed me to be invited to several of their games. And now with the paperback out. I've sent them a copy of that. So I'm a big hero for the Japanese American Baseball League here in Southern California. But Doug is noted to have actually played with some of the professionals or against professionals at that time, because obviously Japanese Americans were not in the actual major leagues. But in the off seasons, the players would actually go to Japan and play. And part of his cover actually getting out of Japan was being part of a Japanese team that was going back to Hawaii. But he was a very smart guy, just basically understated individual. And he ended up going to college at the University of Hawaii, and the story continues on from there.
Leon, how large and influential was the Japanese Shinto community in Hawaii at the time?
As you know, Jim, that community, Shinto religion, predates the creation of the Imperial Japan. So, needless to say, when Issei individuals immigrated to Hawaii, they brought with them that particular religion. And I would say it was very significant, and significant enough that Doug Wada's father was able to make a living creating shrines and developing what they would call camps, or what we would call camps, in the neighborhood that they lived in, which was pretty diverse, not just Japanese Americans, but also Chinese, Native Hawaiians, and others. But it was a significant community, and I think it played large in Doug Wada's life.
Tell us how Doug Wada first got involved with U.S. naval intelligence.
Well, that's a very, very interesting story. As most people that will watch this know, that we knew that Japan was starting to do things in the mid to late 1930s that we had to be concerned about. And after World War I, after most major wars, we reduced our forces in size. And so we had very few people who really knew or could infiltrate the Japanese culture or community in Hawaii, which had grown to be quite large. As most people would know, that they came here to work on the plantations, basically. And so I think with that in mind, it was also a way for them to show that they were actually true Americans. Their allegiance was to America more so than to the imperialism that was happening in Japan. So with Doug Wada, he ended up going to the University of Hawaii, and he had to study. He needed course credits, and one of the courses he took was in Japanese, even though he already spoke it and knew the culture quite well. And at that time, ONI, the intelligence apparatus was pretty fractured at that time. The Army had its units, and ONI had its, and FBI actually was, for lack of better terms, a weak sister in Hawaii. It had a really small presence there. And so they relied on military intelligence agencies to help them with providing counterintelligence support, which was their mission. So what happened was Wada was in class, and they being the FBI, essentially, and ONI, decided, hey, we're going to recruit people that could help them mainly with translation of open source materials that would be seen in the Japanese media. So they made it appear that this was a random meeting, but it was pretty much staged that this Kenneth Ringle, who was an ONI officer, naval intelligence officer, active duty, would be seated next to Doug Wada. And it was interesting that most of the seating was done by alphabetical order in most of his classes. But now you have Ringle sitting next to Wada. So there were some people that were suspicious about that. But Ringle became a great friend of Doug's, and he vetted him for quite some time and decided, well, we should offer him a job. So they brought him in. He was interviewed, offered a job as basically a translator or someone who would work as a journalist at a journalism company who would provide translation services for him. But they saw more in him and thought, oh, we could basically use him as what we would call an agent today. Agent meaning working for an intelligence officer. And Ringle was that particular guy. And the rest is history, but that's how he became affiliated and was recruited to work as an O&I civilian. And this is one of the, I would say, a mistake that we did in the original book. He was not an active duty military officer during the war until later, 1944-45. And the reason being is that although the Army had a pretty large Japanese American apparatus of people, the Navy precluded Japanese from being in the Navy. And that was a decision made by Franklin Knox, who was the Secretary of the Navy. And I'll talk a little bit more about him later. But that's how he first got involved with O&I.
And who was Tako Yoshikawa, and what was his role in this play?
All right. Well, Yoshikawa, another interesting guy, and he was an active duty Japanese intelligence officer. And I would have to say, not deemed to be one of the better intelligence officers. And his boss decided there's something different we think you can do because you're not doing a great job of what you're doing as an intelligence officer for the Imperial Navy. So he became a diplomat. And they sent him to be a deputy consul general in Hawaii. And he was basically the antagonist, although these guys never met. And when I say antagonist, Doug Wada against him. And they probably never met, but they were looking at the same people for different reasons. And so Yoshikawa came here, actually got an undercover name, Morimura, and was deputy consul general at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor.
What intelligence collection operations was Yoshikawa able to perform working out of the consulate? And what was Consul General Kita's role?
Well, I'll answer that last part first. Kita was basically Yoshikawa's handler. And as most people know who have worked in the world, especially the officers that will probably be watching this, that even though you're a diplomat, sometimes our intelligence officers have cover under diplomatic status. And that's pretty much where Yoshikawa was, as well as Kita. And basically, he wanted Yoshikawa to infiltrate organizations in Hawaii that were generational Nisei community organizations. For us, it would be like the Rotary Club and things of that nature. They thought it would be better to find people who were connected with the U.S. Navy by infiltrating those particular organizations. And they were pretty effective. That was something that Yoshikawa was pretty good at because he spoke English quite perfectly and fit in as just another guy who could do certain things like making friends and making himself available for other folks. And that's how he recruited. And when we look at what Doug Wada was doing, it was that and more. He also was looking at people within the local Nisei community that may have been helping the Japanese. And what he found was that the Nisei generation, for sure, were more sympathetic to the American cause than Americans thought. And even Issei, his parents' generation, even though they had a little bit more of a tie to Japan, they had become Americans and they wanted to assimilate as well. So that was the conflict that Doug Wada had was, am I really spying on my own people? And at some point he made the decision to let his handler, Ringle, realize that these people are just as American as anyone else. And that's how the story unfolds.
So after the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, what was the immediate fallout inside the Japanese consulate in Hawaii?
That's interesting as well, Jim. Most people in today's intelligence world, there's a set standard of things that happen if your embassy or consular diplomatic establishment is going to be overrun. Generally speaking, you have a little bit of advance warning. In this case, even though Yoshikawa and Kita were in and knew about the cables that would go back and forth, the Japanese military felt that maybe the U.S. was tapping in on that information. So they were caught by surprise as well. And as far as our intelligence apparatus tapping in, and that was true. So Had the Japanese Navy, in this case, alerted them that, hey, today is the day and this is the hour, H hour, then the consulate would have responded in a way that may have alerted the military there, U.S. military there in Honolulu. So when the bombs started dropping, they were caught off guard. And they being Kita and Yoshikawa, ended up going to the consulate and getting there about the same time that the local police had been dispatched by our people to get there. And they then started burning and destroying all the classified documents and records. And it took about a week, really, before they were actually brought in themselves. But they were caught off guard. And although they knew that at some point this was going to happen, but they didn't know that particular time.
Leon described the Ringle report. And what was its impact on Japanese Americans living in the continental United States?
As I mentioned earlier, Jim, Ringle really became close with Doug Wada. Even though they were students together, at some point, they developed this relationship that many intelligence officers have with their agents. But this particular relationship became even greater. And during that period of time in Hawaii, when he was working with Doug Wada, he learned and felt the same way that Wada did, that, hey, these people that we basically were targeting here are not the enemy. They're with us. And so when Ringle was transferred actually here to the 11th Naval District, here in San Pedro, where I live, by the way, the building is still there where their office was, and now they're converting it into live and work lofts. It became the YMCA during World War II, where the Navy had rooms for sailors to go in and sleep. That's where the intelligence office was. And that was about the time Ringle had put together his report, and to convince the powers to be in Washington that the target should not be the Issei or Nisei generation of Japanese Americans, but the diplomats that were in both Los Angeles and in Hawaii. And that report was sent up to the highest levels. And actually, in the end, when the discussion was, do we put these people in internment camps or do we do something different? Surprisingly, J. Edgar Hoover was against placing them in internment camps. But what we found is that the guy who really had the top influence on FDR was Secretary of the Navy Franklin Knox. And Knox won that argument, and that ended up being a situation where we had thousands of Japanese Americans here in California, including this area that I lived in, which used to be Japanese farmers, and they were interned, and we had an internment camp not too far from where I live here on Terminal Island. In fact, my Marine Corps Reserve unit used to drill in their public school that was established during World War II. So we see that blowback, so to speak, of history just by being in the location that I am. But his report was one that was very important later on that said, hey, what he said was spot on, and maybe we made the wrong decision in doing the internment camps.
So, Leon, were the Japanese Americans in Hawaii put in internment camps? And what other steps were taken for Japanese Americans in Hawaii to prove their loyalty to the U.S. government?
Well, to answer your question about internment camps, the answer is no. But the list that WADA and the other intelligence apparatus, including Army MI and also FBI, had put together, those were used to round up Issei and Nisei generation folks. About 500 is the estimate that they rounded up, and their lists were divided A, B, and C. And the folks that presented the biggest threat were A, B, and then it went that the lower levels were C. And I think at that point, Wada had some regrets because he knew that a lot of those people had not done anything wrong, but they were members of these organizations that the Japanese intelligence agency had targeted. And so once those lists were put together, those people were looked at and many of them were released pretty quickly. So the internment situation in Hawaii was almost nil. Detainees, yes, they did have those. But in California, especially, they were rounded up just like you would round up a group of people just based on what they look like and where they were from and not where their loyalty lies. And in the end, what happened, especially in Hawaii, but also here in the mainland, is that there were so many Japanese Americans that wanted to prove that they were American that they voluntarily wanted to join the military. And that's how we got the 442nd Infantry Regiment and the 100 Battalion, Infantry Battalion, mainly made up all volunteers, basically. And they ended up, most of them, in Europe in that theater of war.
As I recall, the 442nd was one of the most highly decorated units during World War II.
Your recollection is spot on. That is the truth. They fought with distinction. Out of that came our senator Inoue, who was highly decorated afterwards, lost his arm in battle. And they're proud of that. I mean, they're proud of what they did during that period of time, even though even after that, they had a hard time getting their properties back. And I see that history here. I think there's only 2 families who descended from those farmers that still have their farm in our local area here. Now, I have to say they're doing quite well from a monetary standpoint, but most did lose their businesses. And now we're going back trying to recreate some of that. And some who were fortunate where there were whites that bought their businesses or took over the businesses during the war actually did give them back to some of the Japanese owners. So that was good. That was after the war. But yes, that was the case. Both of those units were highly decorated, and hopefully we won't make that mistake again. That was a huge mistake.
What was Doug Wada's naval assignments after VJ Day?
So Doug Wada, first of all, when Franklin Knox passed away in 1944, I believe it was, the Navy then said, hey, now we want to allow Japanese Americans to wear the uniform. And Doug Wada was given a direct commission as a lieutenant in naval intelligence in about 1944, 1945, I believe it was. And going back to Pearl Harbor and all of that, and all the information that they had provided before December 7th, Doug Wada was kind of conflicted on because he was proud that they were able to show certain things, but then very much concerned of what he may have done to basically his own neighbors, because in the end, where they had a detained Shinto priest, his father was never detained, and that pretty much stood out. And there was an obvious reason for that. So when he was able to become an active duty naval officer, that was something that he was extremely proud of. And after the war, he was sent to Japan to be essentially a translator. But more than that, I mean, he was also involved in interrogations. And I'm sure the question will come up, what did he do actually December 7th in terms of interrogation? But afterwards, he was involved in the international war tribunals and mainly doing translations. But one of the most interesting things at that time, between 45 and probably the early 50s, was he seemed to be more proud wearing that Navy uniform than he was being noted as a civilian who was operating undercover for the Navy. And he would go, especially in Japan, because he knew that the Japanese military respected the military so much more. He would wear that uniform when he probably didn't have to do that to do his particular job. So that's something that I thought stood out with Doug Wada.
And back in Hawaii after the war, I think he had one more important escort duty.
Yeah, I can't recall exactly what that was. It was one of the dignitaries from Japan, correct? Yeah.
He took the next prime minister of Japan to the Valley of the Fallen.
That part, it rings a bell. Was that in our book?
And finally,
Here's what I regret in a way in the book, because we didn't do Wada as much justice as I would like, because we stopped pretty much it when the war was over. I mean, we started with the attack on Pearl Harbor, and then we talked about his childhood and all the things that you've asked me about. But we didn't go into what he actually did up until 1978 when he retired from the organization. And I can give you a few groups on that. But he was the first agent, and when I say agent, I'm talking about now special agent, who received orders overseas in our organization. He was the first Japanese American, actually the first non-Caucasian agent that then O and I had hired. And his legacy shows that, right? And what he did in Japan after the war, he was always assigned, it seemed like, to the N2 commander of Naval Forces Japan. But nobody knew what he did. And when we were doing our research and trying to find someone who could say, hey, I knew Doug Wada and this is what he did, it was more like, hey, I knew Doug Wada, but I have no idea what he was doing. So he was very, very much undercover. And when he applied for membership in the Retirees Association, he listed his job as special agent. And in parentheses, it said undercover. So that tells you a little bit about where he's at.
Well, it's a great American story, very well researched and very well told. I want to thank Leon Carroll and Mark Harmon and NCIS for a great AFIO Now interview.
Oh, great. I mean, it was my pleasure, Jim. And you had mentioned what is the legacy of Doug Wada in the agency. And again, very few people knew who he was. But once we did this book, I reached out, I didn't reach out, actually, people reached out to me wanting to know more. And during Asian American History Month, 2 years ago, I think it was still during COVID because it was done on Zoom, there was a period of time where all that was talked about was Doug Wada and his career. And they just came out with an NCIS heritage book, and there's a whole page about his exploits. The National Association of Asian American Police Officers is looking at doing an award in his honor. So he went from being a guy that didn't talk about what he did. And in fact, his family, when we finally were able to connect with them and they decided that they would really help us. And if I have time, can I tell that story really quick?
Sure, please go ahead.
So we do the book, and Mark Harmon and I are on tour in New York. And one of the things that had happened, I had reached out, as had the guys who had been doing stuff 20 years before, to the family. And they did talk to the grandson, I think, once or twice. And then here we are 15 years later trying to recreate all this stuff. And I tried to contact. First, I knew that the mom, his daughter, was still alive, Wada's daughter. And I thought, she's probably in her 90s. I didn't want to cold call someone that was in her 90s. So I didn't, but I did contact the grandson, but he never responded at that point in time. And just turns out that we were doing a satellite tour out of New York, and we were doing an interview on some of the Bay Area affiliates. And as I'm leaving to go to a meeting with our agent, I get a call and I look at the name and I'm like, I don't recognize this name, but I noticed that it was a Japanese surname. And I thought, somebody's going to be ticked about something we said. But I thought I better answer. And it turns out it was Doug Wada's grandson, who apologized at that point for not returning my call or emails and that type of thing, and said how proud he was that we had talked about his grandfather. And I asked him, I says, how did you know about that? He says, you won't believe this, but a friend of my mom's was watching the local news and saw that you guys were talking about our grandfather, and called my mom and says, hey, they're talking about your dad on channel such and such right now. And she turned on and saw that particular issue. And I can't remember which station it was out of, the Bay Area, though. And so I was like, you made my day, And when I told Mark, I met Mark as we were going, and And I says, you won't believe what just happened. And I told him, and I can't repeat the exact words he used, but you got to be me. And I go, no. He goes, that makes our day. Can we talk to them again? And I says, yeah. In fact, he had asked if we would call later today and talk a bit. And we did. And from that, I learned that Doug Wada really didn't discuss what he did with his family until he had a couple of shots of bourbon. And the grandson said to us, he goes, that's how he got the nickname, the moniker of Wada, Doug Bourbon and Wada, because his drink was bourbon. And when he had a couple of shots of bourbon, he would talk a little bit about what he did during the war.
Well, I salute you and Mark Harmon and NCIS for going the extra mile, both for the Wada family, but also for Japanese Americans. I think it's really important that you did that.
It's important to us, and I'll give you one last thing, and that is when we were doing the LA Book Festival, they ask questions, and the audience is pretty diverse here in LA. And afterwards, this older Japanese American lady walked up to me and she says, I want to thank you. And I go, for what? She goes, you referred to us as Japanese Americans. In my lifetime, that's not what we were called early on. And it just, the fact that we were able to do something like that means a lot more to me than anything else, because now she felt welcomed into this American community that at one point, especially during her childhood, and I didn't ask, but I would imagine her family was probably interned.
Sure.
That had all happened. So those kinds of things, even though when I look at it, it was mainly to bring out what a ONI agent had done way back in the day, because we go back through the history of ONI to 1882. But this was the one story where we could start with a particular event. And our goal is always tell stories of little known people involved in big things. And so this was the first one that we picked, and it was it was a New York Times bestseller. So there you have it.
Well, I know that our AFIO audience will really enjoy the story. Thanks again, Leon.
I appreciate it, Jim, and thanks for having me.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.